All right, let's say we were doing a website about budgeting, right? And we wanted to show people how to create a budget. And usually budgets are done in something like Excel. And usually budgets would look something like this, where you have a collection of tables and rows of data. So you have a table here, which is a collection of rows. There's a row for heading. Maybe we would make that bold. Maybe we would center it. There's a row for each month. And then there's a piece of data that shows you how much you've budgeted for that particular bill for that particular month. So for example, this number here represents your anticipated gas bill for January. And of course, you'd probably have totals and other stuff on here too, but we're not going to get too fancy right off the bat. All right. So let's say you want to make a web page and include something like this in it. All right. This is called a table, right? A table is where you have data that is in a series of rows and columns. So each row has a certain number of columns. Now, you might try something like this. So this is going to be incorrect. You might try creating HTML that looks like this, where you're essentially duplicating what you have here. You have a month, electric bill, gas bill, rent, January, February, and I didn't go any further than that. Now, if you think about this really hard, or actually not even that hard, you'll notice that this is not going to work. Why is it not going to work? It's not going to work because remember what web browsers do with the white space that is found in HTML. It converts any white space, and by white space I mean tabs, carriage returns, when you hit enter, blank spaces, it converts all of those into a single space. So let's imagine what this is going to look like if we actually save this and then went to view this web page. And if you guessed it would look like this, you're absolutely right. All those extra lines and spacing that we did are not used by the web browser. It reduces all of those to a single space. So how do we create a table of data? Well, the way you do it is via what's called an HTML table. An HTML table should be used only to show HTML or to show a table of data. You should not try to come up with some kind of concoction where you're going to lay out your page using an HTML table. People did that in the bad old days of web design, and we want to avoid making that mistake now. But if you have a table of data like this, again, data represented as rows and columns, the table tag is perfect for that. So I'm going to start with this one, and I'm going to build a very simple table at first, and then we're going to go to a little more involved example. So the first thing you have with a table is you have a tag that says table. Simple enough, right? So everything between the start table and the end table is considered to be table data. Now, what does the table consist of? It consists of a series of rows. So that's the TR tag. Every TR tag represents a new row. We have 3 rows in this simple example, so I'm going to make 3 TRs. we were doing the full year, we'd have 13 TRs, right? One for each month and then one for the heading. All right. Now, each element in a row, each column in a row, each cell in a row is represented by either a TH or a TD. TH stands for table heading. So in this example, our table heading, first table heading is the month. Second table heading is electric bill. Third table heading is a gas bill. Then finally, our fourth table heading is for rent. Okay, each month then would be its own TR with its own TDs in it. This is TDs because this is data. This is headings, so it's THs. These are data, so that the data would be in TDs. So we'd have a TD, January. A TD for the electric bill. And notice that first TD matches the first TH here. Second TD matches the second TH. Third TD matches the third TH. So they form a column of data. And then the last one, I'm just going to copy and paste. And that would be February. We can get rid of this stuff. So when you look at this code, you see it's a table. There are 1, 2, 3 rows on it, in it rather. Each row has 4 cells inside of it, and each one of those corresponding cells that match up form a column. So month, January, and February is a column. Electric bill, 300 and 300 is a column. Gas bill, 90 and 90 is a column. Finally, rent, 1200 and 1200 is a column. So let's save this and see what we get now. We get something that is at very least lined up correctly. It probably could be better, right? But at least it's not just how it was before, where it was a string of data just going across. These are the basic tags for a table. Now there's going to be more tags and there's going to be some attributes that we're going to look at. And of course, I've not mentioned at all styling. Let's look at the browser's default behavior. By default, browsers make THs bold. So you notice month, electric bill, gas bill, and rent are bold. By default, browsers make THs centered within the column. Now that may be a little deceptive here because you look at this and say, well, that isn't centered. Well, it is. The whole column is the width, though, of that heading, table heading. That's another thing about the default. the browser will make columns or cells, however you want to look at it, as wide as they need to be to hold the data. And therefore, it will make the table as wide as it needs to be to hold the data. What do I mean by that? I mean, if some of the data gets bigger, let's go in and put say we win the lottery and we really are renting now a penthouse apartment. Notice that the table expanded, that cell expanded, and the column expanded to hold that new large piece of data. And again, notice that rent is centered over that. If our gas bill or electric bill were longer, the digits in the TDs were longer, then these headings would also appear centered. Notice that the TDs are left aligned. So we're looking back at Excel. The TDs are all left aligned like that. Now keep in mind, what if we don't like that? If we don't like that, we can change it via CSS. Remember what CSS is, what it's for, and how it works. CSS overrides the browser's defaults. So the browser automatically centers all the THs by default. If we don't like that, we can change it so that it doesn't center it, and we could make it right aligned or left aligned or whatever we want. By default, it also makes it bold. TDs, on the other hand, are not bold and are left aligned. So let's go and start adding some CSS in here. I'll change this back to a more reasonable number. I already have the style sheet coded in here. I just don't actually have a style file yet, so I'll make a new text file. And I'm going to start by saying table. And I'm going to give it a width. So table width 600 pixels. All right, so we have that. So that'll make the table width be 600 pixels. And it will stay 600 pixels regardless how big the window is. So notice if we make our window smaller, it's going to cut off part of the table. What's typically better to do is make the window or make the table a percentage width instead. On a bigger screen, the table's bigger. On a smaller screen, it gets smaller. Now notice a couple things. It puts everything like this and makes each cell long enough to hold the longest thing. But when it gets a certain width, it breaks down electric bill into two words, electric and bill, because there's a space between it. So electric bill is stacked up on top of each other. It doesn't show it just across on one line. Note also, when we get to a certain width, we can make it as small as we want, and it doesn't change what the table looks like. That's because a table is never going to size the TDs or THs to cut off the data. You're never going to have Jan U for the month, all right, and so on. It's not going to cut off that data. So how does it decide how wide to make the columns? It makes it wide in proportion to the data inside of it. So notice rent has 4 characters in it, except this one has 5 characters in it. So the rent column is a little bit smaller than the rest of them. So on the other hand, if we look at electric bill, it's the word electric bill has more characters than rent, or the 2 values for rent. So it makes that the wider one. The browser is a wonderful thing, and it does all these things automatically for you. And it will stay that way unless you override them. What if I wanted the 4 columns to be equal width? Well, I could do that by saying TH width 25%. Now, each column is the same width. It gets bigger or smaller as we make the window size bigger or smaller. But it stays the same width, except when push comes to shove and we finally get so small, it's not, again, going to cut off the word electric. So electric bill will still be the slightly bigger column when the window size is small, because electric is the longest thing in that column. Likewise, month will be bigger because February is the longest thing in that column. And it's not going to cut off any of the characters of February. What if we give the browser impossible tasks? Like I say each TH is 35%. And that doesn't make any sense, right? Because I have 4 columns at 35%. That would be what, 140%? Not going to make sense. Browser tries its best. And in this case, it reverts back to sizing the columns proportionally based on the size of their content. What if we want THs to be a different color? Well, we can do that. And we can say, just as we would do that in any CSS, we can define the background as, let's make it a light shade of gray. Make the text black. And now we have that. Now notice that there's a tiny little gap between each of the THs. Even though we haven't specified a border, there's just a little space, a little between them. If we don't like that, I mean, this looks fine to me, but if you didn't like that, you could say on the table, border collapse, collapse. And you get those things smashed together. So it's your preference. By default, it makes there a little border between each of the cells, but you can go and get rid of that by saying border collapse. Now, let's start making this table the way we might want it to look more. Maybe we want an underline underneath the THs. How can we do that? Well, an underline is really a border underneath the column. So if I said this, for my TH, if I said it's going to put that border on each side, on the top, on the right, on the bottom, and on the left. Because I only specified one set of values for border, and therefore we go around like a clock. Top, right, bottom, left, and we repeat it. What if I only wanted the border on the bottom? Then I could say border dash bottom. We got an underline now. Okay. Notice again, if one thing gets resized, everything in that column gets resized. So let's make the THs a little wider than normal. Make the font size 0.2 em. That makes text in the heading a little bigger than the text in the TDs. Now, we're not just doing this just for it to look good. We're doing this to help the user out. We're giving them visual cues that help them see what the how the table is constructed. I mean, if we have no style sheet at all, let me go and rename that. We have no style sheet at all, everything kind of runs together and nothing really stands out. If we apply a style sheet though, we can really make the header stand out more so than previously. Now, what if I wanted TDs to be centered instead of TDs being, what if I want TDs to be left aligned? No, they're already left aligned. Well, if I want to make them right aligned, I could go into my CSS and say, TD text align right. All right, now notice, I think that looks good for many of them, but maybe I want to do that to the THs as well. I'll put that in the TH. All right, now notice that month and electric bill sort of run together, and I want a little bit of space between those. How can we accomplish that? What allows us to put space in between different elements? That is the margin, right? So I want the margin for the table, or the margin for the THs, to be maybe 5 pixels. So I can say margin 5 pixels. We're using all the things that we used before, in other words. Remember, we used before all these things when we talked about paragraphs and sections and so on. To use a margin, we have to use a display attribute and say inline block. Whoa, that does not look good. What did I do? All right, let's rewind. Let's make margin left. Well, this is a bad idea. We could do instead, we could do padding. It's probably better. Padding, remember, supplies a little bit of space between the edge of something and the text. There we go. So now there's a bigger separation between THs, and therefore we don't easily see that month and electric bill are the same thing. We could make that wider if we wanted to. And again, notice as we make these THs wider, the corresponding TDs also resize themselves. All right, these are the basics of tables. Now let's look at some additional tags associated with tables that we use and talk a little bit more about CSS. So I'm going to bring up the example that is posted online. I did not upload a style sheet with that. You can create your own style sheet. That'll be a good exercise. And we have this. Let's look what additional things we added to it. We added a caption. Caption is sort of like a description, a brief description, like a title for what the table is. In this case, this is a sample monthly budget. So we put up here sample monthly budget. Now, what if we want that to stand out? Well, that's the CSS thing. Remember, browsers do things by default, but we can override those things via CSS. And notice it's the same CSS stuff that we've been using before. We're just applying it to a different set of tags. So I could make the caption font size. Um, 2M. Let's change the font family of it too. Remember, we're not doing this just to make things look pretty. Yes, we want our pages to look good. But in addition to that, we want our pages to visually direct the user's eye and make things stand out that we want the users to notice. So how do you make things stand out so that the user notices? By changing the visual properties to them. Now, I know what you're going to say. It's like, well, what about people that can't see? You know, we talked about accessibility recently. Well, we'll come back to that, what we can do for those people in a minute. I'm going to pick this as my fonts. As we said before, notice there's 3 because each browser may or may not have a given font. Windows has Arial, but not Helvetica. Macs would have at least Helvetica, maybe even Arial, but at least Helvetica. And no matter what machine you're on, even if it's some Linux distribution that's very bare bones, you're going to have at least the default sans serif font. So I can do this and make the sample monthly budget stand out. Anyhow, caption is the first tag. That's important for people that can see, obviously, to give them an idea what the table is. If you just had these numbers up here without this up there, we have no idea what that is. But if we can put some kind of caption on it, well, then that explains to the user what it is. It's also valuable for people that can't see, that's accessing the page by a screen reader. A screen reader does what's called linearizing. In other words, it will read this data as a string of data. Month, electric bill, gas bill, housing, food, January, 123, 523. And it might be easy for someone hearing the data being read to lose track of what this is about. And that caption will also be read to them, and that will help them keep straight what it's about. We have a new tag that's called the T head, and that's to group all the rows together that are headers. We also have a T. We have NT head way down there. That's not right. Should be an NT body. It won't matter how it displays. What's the purpose of that? Well, we can easily define style rules based on T-body if we want. So for example, I could make the T-body and I'm just doing this just for demonstration purposes. Not saying that this is the most attractive looking page, but we could make the background yellow. Color red. Let's make the color blue. That doesn't work. So everything that's a T-body gets that. Now, notice that these columns are still, this column is still all gray. Why is that? Well, because really, if we think about it, the month is really sort of a heading for this row. So what does this represent? It's the gas bill for January. So these are the two headings for that row, column heading and the row heading. Therefore, I put those in TH tags. You notice the month is now in a TH tag. Also notice we have something, an attribute called scope. And do pay attention to this because this is sort of an automatic deduction if you don't include the scope in your web page. The scope says what the column is a heading for. So month is a heading for this column. Electric bill is a column heading. Gas bill is a column heading. Housing is a column heading, and food is a column heading. These, however, the January through all the months, that's the heading for this row. So headings will either be the heading for a column or a row. And the way you designate that is through the scope attribute. And that will help someone that's using a browser, using a screen reader, someone that's visually impaired, also be able to associate what like this number represents. People that can see can tell that is March's housing fee. But if it's being read in a straight line, it might not be easy to understand that. The last thing we do is, for example, January, gas bill is high. So I define a class for high bill. And I could make that to stand out, be a different font size or something like that. How do we designate a class? We put a period in the name of the class. And we'll make it bigger. Just a little bit bigger. Remember, a class can be defined on multiple elements. So for example, we could put this high bill class on any number of TDs if we wanted to. I think I only did one. I did a couple of them. So that makes those numbers stand out. And we could do it, we could change the color, we could change the background, we could do anything we wanted to. We assign the class there. Remember, you can also assign an ID. The difference between a class and ID is that the ID can only be on one element on the page. Now, the one thing I like to do is I like to center this table. And we can do that by saying margin for a pixel auto. That'll do 0 pixels on the top, automatically set the right, 0 pixels on the bottom, automatically set the left. And that centers it. So I tried to demonstrate that we use these CSS things purposefully. In other words, not just to make a nice color scheme, but to show off and to highlight and focus on certain pieces of data. There's something else I want to talk about. Give me a second to try to remember. What was it? I don't know. That thought is long gone now. I'm sorry. We can, oh, this is cool. This is a neat trick. How do we get alternating color rows? Maybe some of you older people remember the green bar computer paper where the lines alternated between green and white. Why would we do that? We do that to make it more readable, especially if the table extends across the width of the browser window. As your eye goes across your eye, if everything was the same color, it would have a tendency to go up or go down. We can instead alternate the colors of the TRs and get something like that. Not a particularly pretty table, but it does get the job done. All right, I encourage you for practice to go and create a CSS for that example that I have uploaded. How do you learn how to do something? How do you learn how to do anything? How do you learn how to play the trumpet? By playing the trumpet. How do you learn to create CSS for things? By creating CSS for things. And start small and try to make it look however you want. CSS is very powerful. We can pretty much make things look exactly the way they look, exactly the way we want them to look, regardless of what the browser defaults are, because we can control all aspects of the visual properties of a given element. All right, that's all I had for today. We will see you next week.